Ever feel like the version of the Stone Age we got back in school was missing something? Like it's always man the hunter,
Hmm.
battling those huge mammoths and inventing spears.
Right, right.
But what were the women up to during all of that? Turns out maybe a lot more than we think.
Yeah, that's where today's deep dive gets really interesting. We're looking at excerpts from this book, Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess by Dr. Moses Seenarine.
Okay.
And he's got this argument that early human societies, especially those way back in the Stone Age, might have actually been structured around, get this, women.
Okay, so not just like surviving, but actually running things.
Exactly.
Wow, that is a very different picture than what we're used to.
Yeah.
So what kind of evidence does he use to back that up?
Well, one of the things Dr. Seenarine points out is that women were far from passive in these early societies. Take pottery, for example.
Okay.
We kind of associate it with the rise of agriculture, right?
Yeah, makes sense. You need something to store all that grain in.
Exactly. But here's the thing. There's evidence of pottery in East Asia that goes back like 20,000 years, which predates any intensive agriculture by a long shot.
So if it wasn't for storing grain, what was it for? And what does that tell us about women?
That's where it gets really fascinating. See, Seenarine argues that these early pottery innovations might have been driven by women for other purposes, like maybe cooking or carrying water or even, ritual practices.
Interesting.
It kind of challenges that assumption that women's roles were only tied to agriculture, suggesting they were innovating and really impacting their societies long before farming took center stage. And it wasn't just pottery either.
Let me guess. Textiles is next. Weren't there some like really early finds of woven materials too?
Spot on. Around 20,000 years ago, you have women creating clothing from spun fibers.
Wow.
Again, well before that typical timeline we associate with these agriculture-driven societies, right?
Yeah.
And the development of textiles, that's a big deal, not just for practical reasons, but for what it tells us about women's influence.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. So it's not just about like the objects themselves, but what they actually represent, about the roles women were playing. So what's Dr. Seenarine saying about the impact of these innovations?
He argues that by, developing these technologies, women weren't just making life easier or whatever. They were shaping the very fabric of their communities, their social structures, their economies, even their relationship with, the world around them.
Right, right.
It really challenges the narrative that those contributions started with agriculture and with, what we think of as civilization.
That is a pretty powerful statement. So
Yeah.
we've got pottery, textiles, anything else that points to this female-centric structure that Dr. Seenarine's talking about.
He dives into some really intriguing ideas about, well, menstruation.
Okay.
Now, I know it's not a topic we typically associate with power,
Right.
but he argues that in prehistory, it may have been a source of really significant female influence.
Okay, now that's definitely a perspective I haven't considered before. So how did something like menstruation translate into like a form of power?
Well, imagine a world without, modern medicine. The ability to track cycles, understand fertility, maybe even predict the best times for gathering certain resources. That would have been incredibly valuable knowledge, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Like having a built-in almanac almost.
Yeah.
And I bet that kind of knowledge was not taken lightly.
Precisely. Dr. Seenarine even discusses the concept of, get this, a sex strike.
What?
The idea that women might have leveraged their menstrual cycles as a way to assert influence within their communities.
Wow.
Now, whether or not that was a, common tactic, who knows? But it really highlights how differently power dynamics might have functioned in those times.
A sex strike in the Stone Age. Talk about a power move.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. In a society where women hold a lot of the knowledge about life and these natural cycles, that's a power dynamic you wouldn't want to mess with. And speaking of powerful women, Dr. Seenarine also talks about those woman goddess figures found all over the world. What role do they play in his theory?
Yeah, these figures, often depicted as, voluptuous, fertile, and connected to nature, they're more than just pretty carvings.
Right.
They represent a widespread reverence for women and this deep connection to the natural world, which is a key element of what Dr. Seenarine calls ecogynocentrism.
Ecogynocentrism. That's a mouthful. So break it down for me. What does that even mean?
Essentially, it's the idea of a society built on respect for both women and nature, where those two concepts are deeply intertwined. These goddess figures basically become physical representations of that worldview, a worldview that challenges a lot of our assumptions about early human societies.
So we've got these goddess figures, right, representing this like powerful connection between women and nature. But I'm also thinking about, how we usually associate those cave paintings and all that early storytelling with men. Does Dr. Seenarine address that at all?
He does, yeah, and he kind of challenges that assumption, too.
Okay.
Like, think about it. Who do you think was mainly responsible for actually teaching language to the next generation back then?
Well, I mean, it had to be the primary caregivers, right? And that probably, I'm guessing, fell to the women in most cases.
Exactly. So Dr. Seenarine argues that women likely played a much bigger role in, like, the development of language than we usually give them credit for.
Makes sense.
And it wasn't just spoken language either, think about women passing down traditions, songs, stories.
Yeah, like those female folk songs we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
It's like a whole library of ancient wisdom is woven into music, and it's often passed down through the women of a culture.
Precisely. And, those animal folk tales,
Yeah.
the ones that are super common across so many cultures, those aren't just bedtime stories, right?
Okay.
Dr. Seenarine sees them as, like, windows into a totally different relationship with the natural world.
Different how? I mean, we still tell stories about animals today.
True, but there's a real shift in perspective here. See, in these early oral cultures, animals are often part of creation myths, like woven into the very fabric of existence right alongside humans. They're not just, like, resources to be exploited,
Yeah.
They're seen as powerful beings with their own wisdom and agency. There's a sense of respect and interdependence that's, honestly, it's pretty striking.
So it's less about humans sit at the top of the food chain and more about, like, understanding our place within this whole web of life.
Are there any specific examples of those kinds of stories in the book?
Yeah, he talks about the Lenape tribe.
Okay.
They have this story about how all the animals, they left their land because the people weren't respecting them, right?
Wow.
And it was only when the tribe realized, like, hey, we're all connected here, and they vowed to honor the animals, that balance was restored to their world. It's like that saying, right? Be careful how you treat the earth. It's not given to you by your parents. It's loaned to you by your children. It's like they had this deep understanding of consequence and responsibility, even back then. But okay, so if these early societies were potentially more egalitarian, more in tune with nature, all of that, what happened? How did we get from ecogynocentrism to, well, patriarchy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
It's definitely a complex transition to unpack, and Dr. Seenarine suggests that the domestication of animals might have actually played a role.
Domestication. So you mean like the shift to farming?
Yes, but he takes it a step further. See, he argues that the same forces that led to humans, controlling and exploiting animals, well, they might have contributed to the subjugation of women, too.
So instead of this, like, harmony with nature and with each other, you start to see this movement toward control and dominance.
Exactly. And look, this wasn't some overnight change. It was gradual, right? And there were probably a lot of different factors that contributed to the rise of, patriarchal structures over time.
So we've gone from women potentially, like, shaping these early societies to this gradual shift toward more male-dominated structures. It really makes you wonder, what got lost along the way?
Yeah, it's a question worth, pondering for sure. Dr. Seenarine argues that the shift away from ecogynocentric principles, it had this huge impact, and not just on, how societies were structured, but on, like, humanity's whole relationship with the natural world.
You mean that idea of harmony and interdependence we were talking about?
Exactly. When that dominant worldview shifts,
Yeah.
from cooperation and respect to, like, control and exploitation.
Right.
Well, it impacts how we view everything, really, including, the environment.
And it makes you wonder, what if?
Yes.
Like, what if those early societies had held on to those, those ecogenocentric principles? Would our world even look the same today?
Yeah.
I mean, would we be facing the same environmental crises?
Oh, it's a total thought-provoking question. And it's definitely one that Dr. Seenarine wants us to consider. He's not saying it's simple, like a straight A to B cause and effect, but he's suggesting that just re-examining our past, right, including the roles that women played in shaping those early societies, it can offer some really valuable insights for us, even now.
So it's not just about, like, rewriting history or something. It's about understanding how these, like, historical narratives we have, they actually impact how we understand the world today.
That's the power of a book like this, Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess. It makes you question all these assumptions, these long-held assumptions, and consider different ways of seeing, well, everything, really. The past, the present, even the future.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. So for anyone listening who's like ready to ditch that old textbook version of prehistory and really explore these ideas further, I highly, highly recommend diving into Dr. Senarine's work.
100%. It's a fascinating read, but it definitely makes you think.
Well, that's the beauty of a good deep dive, isn't it? It leaves you with more questions than answers and a whole new way of looking at the world.